Hi, Dr. P here to talk today about one of the 10 fundamental structures of games, sequencing. I think there's a fundamental framework for all games, which I call the 10 structures, or substructures if you prefer. I identified these structures in order to help aspiring designers and students conceive new games. They can consider each of these 10 things and think about what their answer is while they're making notes to conceive a new game. For me, virtually every game includes these structures in one form or another, even if what you do is ignore or reject it. And this is about one of those structures, sequencing. There are mostly two ways to sequence games. Turn-based, which is typical of tabletop games, and real-time, which is common in big video games, AAA style video games. Not so common in casual games. Often they're turn-based as well. There is a third major method, simultaneous adjudication, which combines aspects of the two, and there are other methods as well. So we have turn basis, simultaneous adjudication, real-time, what I call committed intent, and interrupts, which can also be called instance or reaction moves sometimes. So, turn basis. One player plays at a time, takes his or her turn. There are several ways to implement this. You can have the same sequence each time. You can have a serpentine sequence where you go 1, 2, 3, 4, and then the fourth player plays again, and then the third player, second and first. You can have random, such as in Chariot Lords. You can bid or otherwise compete for turn order. You can pass who goes first around the table. So the first person plays first in the first round, the second person plays first in the second round, third person plays first in the third round, and so on. You can have the turn order based on points or something else that can be objectively measured quickly. You might have the player with the most points go first, or you might have the player with the fewest points go first. Turn basis is typical of what I call brainware, games where the primary activity is thinking. It's typical of tabletop games because simultaneous is really difficult to implement. And real time is just about impossible to implement. A virtue of turn-based is that it gives players time to think, but it's also possible to result in analysis paralysis, where a player thinks and everybody else has to wait. Of course, in a real-time game, if you sit there and think, and especially if you get analysis paralysis, you're going to get yourself falling behind because the other players are going to be doing things. Turn basis also results in downtime, time between turns when the players who aren't taking their turn may have little to do. In traditional hobby games, when a player wasn't taking their turn, they would think, but in the kinds of games we have nowadays, which are often more like party games, there's not much thinking to do, or players are not going to be inclined to think anyway. Now, turn basis can be divided into smaller increments, as in committed intent, which I'll talk about in a bit. Or you can have other players have opportunities to interrupt a player's turn or to give a reaction move after a player has done something. Real time is pretty much the opposite of turn-based and turns a game into more or less athletic wear. For example, in StarCraft, if you want to be a great StarCraft player, you have to be able to do 200 actions per minute. In real time, the faster you can give orders, the quicker your pieces, your assets, whatever they are, will take an action. What real time discourages is analysis paralysis. Again, if you're sitting there thinking, not doing anything, you're going to fall behind. You snooze, you lose. Now, real time more or less incorporates simultaneous adjudication without the available thinking time. So the third method is simultaneous adjudication. Now, real-time discourages logical thinking in a way that simultaneous adjudication does not, because you don't have the thinking time. It encourages the use of intuition and heuristics, rules of thumb, and trained reactions. This is why soldiers go through so much training so that when they're in a dangerous situation, because of course war is real time, they can simply react according to their training and have a better chance to survive. Intuition, of course, is coming to a conclusion without an explicit logical path, a gut feeling, in other words, and it's quicker, although it's not generally as efficient as logic. So, simultaneous adjudication lets each player think, then all give their orders. And in a tabletop game, that means generally they have to write their orders down, like in the game Diplomacy. And then all those orders are adjudicated simultaneously. So the action of the assets is simultaneous, even though the action of the players is not. This introduces additional uncertainty compared to turn basis, because you're not able to see what your opponent has done. And that's because all actions are revealed at the same time. It's like real time because everything happens at once when it finally happens. So, simultaneous adjudication reduces downtime because everybody's figuring out their move at the same time, as most famously implemented in the board game Diplomacy. But it's possible in Diplomacy because there's only a maximum of 34 pieces in the game Diplomacy. Now, I think if you tried to introduce Diplomacy today, it would not do very well, simply because people would not be willing to write down all those orders. But we'll never know. It comes from 1959. The video game Eastern Front from 1981 by Chris Crawford was the first time I saw simultaneous adjudication in a video game. Each player gave his orders on his computer, and then they both saw those orders mesh together as they were simultaneously adjudicated. Now, simultaneous adjudication is hard to implement on the tabletop, much easier in video games. The computer can make it easy for players to give orders. The computer can do all the adjudication, which can get complicated. A tabletop game recently that tried to use something like it, Game of Thrones, the board games. Here you put pieces down next to each of your armies that indicate what you're going to do, and then players gradually execute those. And that is related to committed intent. Now, I don't think that's a universally accepted term, but I'm going to use it here. It's a compromise between a standard turn base and simultaneous. Each player secretly indicates in some way what kind of move he or she is going to make. Once again, in Game of Thrones, the board game, the players put markers face down. In most games, you choose a card. Each player in the game will have the same selection of cards, and you place it face down in front of you, and then they're all revealed at the same time. So, the choices have initiative values, and they're executed in order of initiative. And there are tiebreakers derived from the state of the game, such as who has more points or who has more areas in control, something like that, when two players have made the same choice with the same initiative. Then you have things you can add to turn basis or committed intent, which can be called variously interrupts, or instances, what they're called in Magic the Gathering, or reaction moves. So it interrupts the other player's turn. Typically that's going to be to play a card and then execute the card. But a reaction move could be to enable one player to reinforce some defenders or to intercept attackers. So it provides a semblance of simultaneous action, even though it isn't in fact. It certainly allows an immediate reaction to an opposing play. And you can have more combinations, turn-based with interrupts, committed intent, and other methods that divide the turn into smaller increments, again to try to approach simultaneous. Shenandoah, which made some video games converted from board games, reduced it to having a player move one area's occupants at a time, alternating with the opponent. but no unit could move more than once in the overall turn, and the computer kept track of that. Of course, games can use different sequences at different junctures. As an example, often in a war game, the combat is independent. Both players roll to see what happens, and that's usually simultaneously adjudicated, even if the rest of the game isn't. As an example of these kinds of combinations, in a game I recently devised, which is a fantasy fleet space battles of all things, a player chooses to either move a ship or shoot with one each play, and then the other player plays, and they go back and forth, but each ship can only move once during a round and only shoot once. So that's highly interactive between the players and approaches simultaneous. And it works very naturally for ships and ship-to-ship battles. Random turn order, I'm going to say something separately about that. It's rarely seen. I've only seen it in Chariot Lords. I recall playing a video game, which I think was Warlords 3, a long time ago, that had random turn order, and I hated it because the result could be that somebody'd play twice before you could play again and just randomly really mess you up. It very much depended on the time that things occurred. Now, is any one of these better? Well, turn-based is obviously artificial, but it's easy to implement. And the more players you have, the less desirable turn-based is because of downtime. Real-time is hard to implement on tabletop. It's usually implemented in video. Unfortunately, it becomes as much a race as anything else. Who can assign the most orders the fastest? So that's kind of artificial as well. Simultaneous, I think, is desirable for games with conflict and probably for most any kind of game, because it's in between and it's more realistic than either of the extremes. But once again, it's hard to implement on tabletop, though not so hard on video, but rarely seen in video, I find. I personally like, for tabletop, both committed intent and interrupts, because they break the turn into smaller parts and allow the opponents to participate during another player's turn. Now, think about how important this choice is. What would a game like chess be like with simultaneous moves or with interrupts? It'd be quite a different game. This is a fundamental choice when you design a game. Thanks for listening.